So today we'll talk about an introduction to CSS. CSS is all about styling. So today is all about style. We have lots of puns and jokes about coding with style. So we're going to demo today's project. We're actually transitioning now out of back-end coding. We've been working. Our last project has been all about coding on the back end, coding on the server, where our server running Tiny App would generate HTML and send that to the browser, and the browser render that. And that's what's called server rendering, or the HTML is assembled on the server and the browser just shows what it's got. Okay. Well, now we're going to move on to our next project, and this is all about client-side code, where the server really doesn't do anything at all. It's virtually everything is done on the browser. And let's do a quick demo of our next project. It is called Tweeter, and it looks like this. So this is our next project. It's kind of a Twitter clone, or X, but I can't bring myself to call it X. It's Twitter, really is. So it's a single page app. So once it's loaded from the server, it doesn't have any contact at all with the server. In fact, the server can be shut down and this app will still work unless it has to do something like write some data or something. And this app is a single page app. And you notice the page changes dynamically. So for instance, if I type in this field, you notice that counter is going down as I type. This is all done on the browser now. Of course, you can't really see it, but if this was like Tiny App, this would be refreshing my page every time I did something, which would then change that number. Of course, you can imagine that's not terribly efficient. I can't have the page refreshing every time I type because that wouldn't work at all. So this is now browser side code. So hello world. So I can type an item into my tweet and the counter goes down. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I can take and paste them in there. I think it goes red. Let's take a look. If I type too much stuff, yeah, it turns red if I enter too much stuff. So I'll just put that back. There we go. So that's one feature of our app. Another feature is we can press tweet and it should add a tweet. Hello world. Yeah, it puts a random name in there. So I can add more tweets. I can add hey, and it adds a tweet to my tweet. Now you notice this page is not refreshing. It is kind of hard to see, but you can see there's nothing happening on my server. In fact, let's take a look at the dev tools. Watch that. Let's go to the network tab. We're going to clear there. Let's watch. Now with dev tools, you'll find that for watching things like JavaScript, it's better to have this thing on the bottom. Okay, so let's put this on the bottom for watching network and JavaScript. However, for CSS, it is by far much better to have it on the right. So we can move it around easily. So let's take a look at our network tab. So I'm going to refresh my page for the first time. I'll just there. I'll say all. I'll load my complete page. And you see all the components of my page load. Looks like a favorite icon. Looks like some font stuff. Oh, a lot of stuff here. Wow. Okay. Maybe some CSS. So we're loading a bunch of other files. I'll clear that. And now if I do something, nothing is happening. There is no communication with the back end. Of course, if I submit something, it's going to send that to the server. And that's basically it. Okay. It does reload these tweets again. We didn't really want to make it difficult to just have things dynamically add, but most of the work is done on the client. It's all client code, right? And interesting, you got this little thing in hover. You hover over a tweet, it changes color. That's a requirement as well. So all these interesting things with styling. There we go. So there, changes color like that. Got this little button there where I can turn this text input on and off. Very cool. Okay. We'll be using a library called jQuery. You may have heard of that. And that's one of our next lectures. We learn about jQuery. And that's where all this magic comes from. It allows us to manipulate the DOM, or the document object model, in JavaScript. Okay, so this is what we're building. Now for styling wise, because this talk's all about styling. So we have our little hideable thing there. We have our hover, which is kind of cool. And one thing we do is this thing is going to be responsive. So we're going to make or have you design this application in two different modes. Right now it's in desktop or tablet mode, where we have a device that is wider than it is tall, much like a desktop or a tablet. And the other mode it is there in phone mode or narrow mode. You notice it changes. So this is what's called a responsive app. In other words, it responds to the size of the device. So things rearrange on the screen depending on the size. There. Now the cool thing is, in our dev tools, we even have, let's put this back on the right. There. There are many ways we can control this, right? So let's take a look a little bigger. There we go. Okay. So there's a button now in Firefox and in Chrome. There's a button right there that we can actually control the device we're using. For instance, right now, this is a Galaxy Note 20, Android 11. So this is simulating running my app on a Galaxy Note 11. Maybe on an iPhone 11 Pro, slightly different. What does my app look like on that device? So in DevTools, you can press this little phone symbol and you can simulate or even enter custom items to tell you what it look like. You're going to rotate, and now the phone is now sideways. So very cool. So this is something we'll do a lot of. We're only doing two in this case, but when you're doing a real app, you might, as you're testing your app and coding your app, you might want to make sure it looks good on a number of different devices. A commercial product, we'd be using lots of different devices. A Kindle Fire, what is that? Oh, okay, I guess it's a little bigger. I've never used a Kindle. Okay. There's an iPhone. There's lots of different sizes you can pick. I'll go with an S20. I'll assume I can afford an S20. Okay. All right. So our app is responsive, and I can go back and I can just pick right back to desktop mode again. Okay. I'm just using my mouse to change the size to make it a bit easier to view. So this is our app, and all the code runs on the front end. There is no backend coding, no express, no routes, no request response. Thank goodness. It's all 100% router code. All right. Now, the first day of Twitter, or first few days of Twitter, is all about styling, all about getting these things to position in the right place, have the right color, maybe have these borders. It's all about styling. Okay. And today we're going to talk really all about styling with a little bit of HTML, just enough so we can get by. The intent is not to make us HTML experts, just to know a little bit of HTML, because that stuff is easily able to find it on Google. Okay. The nice thing about what's called a single page app, it is you load once and you never load it again. Because it's called a single page app, you'll hear the term SPA, SPA, actually stands for single page app, SPA. It's load once and never load again, unless you need to browse away to a different page. So generally we load this app once and it never gets loaded again. Okay, right. Now we can do this with Express, but what I'm going to do is something different. Let's make ourselves a very small file. So we'll close down our tweeter. Let's go ahead and make ourselves an index.html, because that's really the core file. So make a file here, and I'll call it there, index.html. All right. And I'm going to fill in some HTML. I'll use the exclamation mark and Emmet, hit enter, and it fills in some really cool stuff for me. Okay, and I'll call this my CSS demo, right? So what I want to do is I want a way to serve out this file. Let's give it some content. I'll just give it an H1. H1 is one of the header tags there. I'll call this my CSS demo. Now I want some way to deliver this file to my browser. I haven't got Express, so I need a server. Now this is what's called a web server. Now we've heard the term web server sometimes referred to when we talk about Express, but Express is just a node module. Is actually what's called an application server. In other words, it runs applications and then serves out the results. A web server, in the truest sense of the word, is a server, and all it does is serve out files. So I need to have this file served out to my browser. Okay. So there is a way to do it Express using the static middleware. It's a little more complex. We might do it a little later, but that's not really our purpose of today. We're going to talk about CSS. So what I'm going to do, I've got my file here. Let's take a look. Should be here. There it is, indexed HTML. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a package. It's called HTTP server. It's a node package. Let's go to the site. Go there. We'll take a look at it. There. So node HTTP -server. There it is. There. Go to npm. A simple static HTTP server. Huh. Serves up static files like they were turtles strapped to rockets. I'm not sure if that's a selling point or not, but anyway. So now let's take a look at the downloads. This is, 18 million so far this week. A pretty popular package. So obviously a lot of people, it's only Tuesday. So there's a lot of downloads per week of this module. It's very, very common to use. So when I want to serve out file quickly, this is my go-to. How do we use it? It's pretty simple. There. npx HTTP servers. Anybody used npx before? That's a different one, isn't it? Anyone use npx? We've used npm. We've used nvm. Now we have npx. What on earth is that? Let's take a look. So go npx. What is that? Oh, it allows us to execute scripts. Stop that now. Whoop. Control D. There. So we can actually run this module directly without installing it. So what npx does, it allows us to run really any module, as long as it has a runtime entry point, without installing it. So we can go npx HTTP server. We can optionally tell it what file to run. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's all we have to do. Let's give it a try. So npx HTTP server. I enter. Oh, well, that was kind of cool. And it's running. It may take a second to load in your system because it's been cached in mine, but it's very, very small. There, I've got some basic things here. It looks like it's serving, but what's it serving here? It's now serving /. So without any parameters, I told it to serve out the contents of this directory. So what does that mean? Well, it means that this server is serving anything that's in my directory. What's in my directory? Well, it's those files. Okay. Now, because of the way that most servers work, there's what's called the default file or the default path. And generally, it's accepted to be index.html. If that file exists in a directory and your server serves out the directory, and you simply say, go to slash, which is that directory, you'll get this file. Okay, let's give it a try. So npx http server. It's serving. I'm going to go here. I think I can go control click or command click. Let's try that. I can. Oh, and there is my file. And it looks like it's telling me what it's getting as well. There we go. So it did a get. Looks kind of like Morgan. I'm suspecting there's probably a flavor of Morgan going on here as well. It is doing a favicon. We can ignore that. But there's my get slash, and my get slash served my file. Now, what if my file wasn't called index.html? Take a look. Let's rename my file. We'll call it something else. What we'll call it, we'll give it the Microsoft name, default.html. And what happens? I just get the directory. I literally get the directory. I can go into here and whatever's in there. Wow. Now, obviously, I don't want to be serving out a bunch of files. I want to serve out the file myself, which is my HTML. So Microsoft tried and failed to convince the world that the default name for a directory should be default. They failed at that one. No one listened. The default name is index. I think Microsoft app servers will, however, recognize the name default. And honestly, in most web servers, you can configure what it looks for anyways. So, but out of the box, most servers will respond to index.html as a default. In fact, even just HTM, does that work? Let's take a look. Apparently not. The file name has to be index.html. However, there's nothing to say I couldn't open that file directly. I can go 8080/index.htm, or of course, just click on that file and I open that file. So now I've got the full path of the HTML, but if I give it the path without anything else, the server first looks for what's the default file, or has it got a default file? In this case, I do, because I'm going to call HTML. There. And now when I go to my root of my directory, just like that, and refresh, and there we go. Just a little aside. This is why files are commonly called index.html. It's one of those fun facts of the internet. All right. So here we go. Here's my very small little CSS. Okay. So let's do a quick review of HTML. We've done this before. We know it's a tree structure, just like we did in vampires or the org chart. We have the HTML, which is the parent. And inside this HTML, also called a container, is child components. So we can say that head is a child of HTML, and body is a child, and this H1 is also a child of body. You can also say that this H1 is contained within, or is the content of the body. This is all the jargon that we use. Container, contained within, content. You'll hear these terms used quite a lot. Okay. So these are normal tags. Common tag we'll see is a div. We've used these before. Just a div. Looks like this. Okay. It has an opening tag and a closing tag and pointy braces. Okay. And a div, or a container, which is a tag with an opening and closing container, can have content. Hello, for instance. There, hello. There's my div. So this is the kind of element that's called container, or can contain something. Buttons can also contain things. In fact, you can go rename symbol in your VS Code and say button. This is extremely helpful, or just F2, by the way, on a PC or Windows, and change it. It renames the entire tag. The hardest thing to do is try to find the matching one and rename it. So I use that a lot. F2 or right-click rename symbol is the best way to rename tags or variables as well in JavaScript. Okay, so a little theory on elements. Now, these are elements that have opening and closing tags. There's another kind of element that doesn't have opening and closing, for instance, input. An input has no content. It is a self-closing tag, and it cannot have content. If we put one here, doesn't matter. It might close it because that's legal in XML. Doesn't even like that. See, look at that. It won't even let me do that. Usually VS Code would help me. Let's try that again. Yeah, look at that. Doesn't like me close it. So an input is a self-closing tag. It cannot have any content. And there's a few of these as well. We have inputs. We have a BR. Seen those before. Want to make a blank line. And also images. Very common. You'll see these are only self-closing. They cannot have any content. And that's an important point. Okay. All right. By the way, you don't have to have the slash pointy bracket. The browser will try to guess, but it's very good practice to add it. In XML, you're required to, but HTML is a little forgiving, and you can get away without having a closing tag, but I wouldn't recommend it, because if you open a form and forget to close it, it might stick the closing form like anywhere. You never know. So I always recommend have a closing tag, although not required. What happens if I do this? Let's try that. If I forget my closing button, it puts the entire app inside a button. It didn't crash, but it just had to guess. So, well, where's that thing go? Well, it figures, well, I guess it ends here. So it figured out or tried to guess that you want your closing button there. Not the best guess. Okay, so I always recommend make sure you have your closing tag. All right. All right, so that's basically all the theory we're going to do on HTML. All right. So also we can have elements can also have what are called attributes. Anyone heard that term, attributes? For example, I can have on my ID or my H1, I can have an ID equals and give it an ID of, well, header. So ID is an attribute of this H1. I can also have a class equals, I'll call it header as well. Okay. Now we know that with IDs and classes, you can only have one ID. We know that, don't we? You cannot have any other element in your document with the ID of header. If you do, it'll just override the previous one. Only one. What's the expression? There can be only one. That was a really old cult show from it was the 90s, I think. All right. So, but classes, you can have multiple elements with classes. Okay. So important point, IDs can only be one, but classes you can have as many as you want. Okay. So for instance, let's go ahead and build ourselves some code. I'm going to build myself a little profile page. There we go. So I'm going to make some quick little content. Let's make a body. Got my H1 here. I'll leave that class there for now. Okay. Now, before HTML5, what we had to do is we had to put everything inside divs. So I'll put a div here. There. Now, the nice thing about VS Code, if I type in div and control or command space, Emmet will try to fill in a complete div for me. It's very, very handy. So I recommend that. So you type div with no pointy bracket. So div, wait a second, or press control space, it'll populate the div for you. I use this feature an awful lot. There's my div. And inside my div, I'm going to put, call this my header. In fact, let's put this here. I'll call this my header. Well, maybe that H1 is just as our title. There. So I've got my div, and I'm going to call this my header. And inside this, I'm going to have an H2 there. And I'll call this my profile page. Profile page. And let's make an image inside here. Image, and we'll say source equals, and I think I have something images slash profile dot JPEG. Oh, look, VS Code actually found it. Sometimes VS Code is very handy. So, okay, so there's my image source. I'll give it an alt. I'll say alt equals, in case the image is broken, it'll show something else. Okay, let's put an alt here. Oops, there. Alt equals, and I'll say a picture of me. Okay. Now, alt tags are actually very useful. Now, they are used in case the image is broken. You'll see that. Okay, you'll just see the text. You'll see a broken, I think we've all seen that before. You go to a page and all these broken picture links. What's that? And then maybe text. You'll see this. But what they're more useful for is for screen readers. If someone is visually impaired, it'll say a picture of me or a picture of Gary or something as a screen reader, which is also very useful. Okay, so it's used for accessibility. Okay, so and let's go ahead, make another thing. I'll make maybe let's maybe put let's put a main there. Put a main here. There we go. And more divs. So div here, there. And I'm going to my code, I'm going to add maybe some articles about myself, some different things I want to have people know about me. Okay, so this contains this will be my container of all my little articles. So I'll put a div here, and this will be one of those articles. And I'll maybe make a paragraph, and I'll say my work. So different things about me. And I've got maybe several of these there. Maybe my hobbies, which I have none, so that's going to be a very short article. Work is definitely going to be a huge article. And my pets there. My pets. I have a little dog, so he's like about the size of this keyboard. No, I think he's smaller. So my pets. Okay, so there's there's my page. Okay, so a photo of me and all my things about me. Okay. Any questions so far on this? Okay. Once again, feel free to shout out in the chat if you have any questions. I'm going to be going a little slow. I know this is stuff we've covered before, but I'm going to go a little slow to start just to make sure we cover all the bases because we haven't really formally covered some of these items. So we do have to cover it. All right. So this is what the page would look like pre-HTML5. Okay, we'd have div, and then separator, and then div again. So lots of divs, and this is what code looked like before we had HTML5. But after HTML5, something happened, okay? We could use what's called semantic elements. Let's take a look at this. What are semantic elements? Let's Google that. When I hear a new word, I just Google that word. So HTML semantic tags. Wow, let's take a look. What are semantic tags? What is it? How to use it correctly? Semantic HTML. So this is a thing. And let's go to this one here. I'm not a big fan of W3 schools, but this one's actually not bad. So non-semantic, div and span. That was kind of all we had, right? A semantic tag is a tag that it's still a div, but it describes what it does. So, for example, an article is a semantic tab, and there's a lot of semantic tags. Article, aside, details. What is a fig caption? I have no idea what a fig caption is. Fig caption. Can't imagine, okay? A figure, these make sense. Header and footer, main, mark, nav, section, summary, time. These are all semantics, but these, it's important to note, are all just divs. That's all they are. They behave like divs. The browser treats them like divs. They're there for our benefit, not for any real functional purpose. For example, I'm looking at this div. Now, where's the closing tag to this div? I'm not quite sure. And back in the day, we had to maybe put a comment here. We'd say, put a comment, we'd go there, end of article container. And we did this a lot because they were all divs. And sometimes you have like 5 levels of divs, and it was really difficult to find out where does one end. Now, and of course, now we have VS Code that will highlight that for you. But if there's 10 or 20 and you're down, 100 lines of code, it might not be so clear where the closing tag is. So instead, we can use semantic elements. It's really just for our purpose. It's for developers. It's for us to make things easy for us. Okay. But important to remember, they're just divs. So let's do an example of this. Let's change this to using semantic elements instead. Okay, so right now I've got my head here, which is fine. I've got my body. H1's not bad. Now this is a header, and it turns out, as we learned, a header is a semantic element. So I'm going to call this instead, I'll use the good old F2 or rename symbol and call this a header. Oops, try it again. Header. There we go. And now I've changed that div to a header. It's a little more readable. Okay. And the same with my container. I'm going to call this a section of my main. So I've got a section here. Okay. So I'm going to call this the article section. So this is my section. There. And these can be articles. There. Fortunately, it doesn't rename them all, but that's all right. Oop, article. Come on. There. And this one, article. Okay. There are other semantic elements. For instance, I might have a footer at the bottom. So I've got maybe a header here. I've got my main. I might have also a footer after my main. Let's take a look. And yes, Emmett notices a footer. And I might have maybe some contact me, for instance, me link, and maybe a tweeter link as well. We'll call it tweeter link since we're using Twitter this week. There, okay. Once again, they're all just divs. There's another one. It's called an aside. An aside is something that's usually off to, well, you probably guessed it, off to the side. And sometimes it's used for things like ads. Yay. It's very common for that. We'll add an ad. We'll say we're getting some ad revenue. So we'll put an aside here. And sure enough, there's an emit for aside. And we'll just say ads show here, unless we have an ad blocker, which I like to use all the time. Okay, there. So does my page change a lot? Let's take a look. Of course, we've added the footer and header, but really it's the same thing. There's really no change. These are just divs. Oh, my P, like at my end of my P right there. Let's close off my P. There. There we go. So just divs, but they're semantic. They're just easy to look at. That's really all. One interesting thing about semantic tags, though, that is a functional difference. Oh, the question is, can you explain the idea? Yes, I'll do it in a second. One interesting thing about semantic tags is search engines love them. For example, Google search. If you use semantic tags in your page, it will notice, oh, you've written your stuff with semantic tags. It ranks you higher. Okay. It notices you trying to organize your HTML using HTML5, and it's more friendly. So they will rank you higher if you're using semantic tags. It's one of those go figure kind of things. So it does better. Okay. Now let's talk about IDs again. So yes, these are attributes, and I can add random ones. I can simply go, you know, um, my ATR equals and just do stuff. We can add anything you want. We don't commonly do that in HTML. So these are what are called attributes. So they're really key value pairs, key value or name value pairs. And the two we're going to concern ourselves with today are IDs and classes. ID is simply a tag. It identifies that specific element only. So this header has the ID of header, so nothing else can have an ID of header. I can certainly do it. It doesn't generate an error. When we start using it in jQuery, it's not going to work because this one now will override that one, and this one will be as if it disappeared. So we can only have one ID, but a class, it refers to a specific class of elements. So I can have maybe here, I can say class equals article. And each one of these is a class equals article. Now it's redundant because it is an article tag, but we can do this as well. So all of my articles have a class equals article on them, okay? Or I could say class equals doc or document or something like that, okay? Now, this can be confusing. Let's call it something else. Call it class of doc there. Because I don't want to mislead you in thinking that the name has to be the same, okay? So would the ID attribute be used for linking to a specific spot on the page? It can be used for that, yes. We can do that as well, okay? But in the kind of code we write, we don't normally do that anymore. Okay, there's no more links because we're talking single page apps. So there are no more links. In other words, no more A's. We do not have any of these. Those things right there, oops, A. I got an emmet for that. Is there an A? Let's try an A all by itself. A. Emmet, yes. We will not see any more of these again. They're back in the 90s where they belong, okay? There. We do not use A's anymore. All right, so now I've got my class. And by the way, we can add more than one class to an element. For example, maybe my doc, and maybe this will be the class of work. And I'll give it a class of doc and the class of hobbies. And then when we add classes, we don't put two classes. We don't say class equals and class equals hobbies. We can't do that. Instead, we have one class attribute and we space separate them. So hobbies. There. Hoobies. There we go. And this is also class equals pets. So now this article has a class of doc and it has a class of pets. Very cool. So this is very common, having multiple classes for an element, okay? But there can be only one ID, all right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about separation of concerns, okay? So we have the HTML. This is like the skeleton of the app. It's the structure, the content, and in general, the rough order of the page. So we know that this probably comes roughly first. This probably comes roughly second, although we can override this with CSS quite a lot. But in general, this is the next thing that comes. And then these things come next. So this is the content and the rough order. There's no styling really on here. Now I may say, wait a second, Gary, you said there's no styling. I can see very clearly that there is styling going on here. This is clearly larger than that, and it's larger than all of these. So what do you mean there's no styling? Well, that is true, but the HTML doesn't have any explicit styling. What's happening is that's the browser. And the browser is looking at that H1 tag and it's saying, I'm going to style H1s this way. And the browser has decided that for their browser, this is how they render H1. So the H1 has no real explicit or even implicit styling in itself, but many browsers choose to render H1s, H2s, H3s, etc. in a specific way. We'll talk a little more about that a bit later. We talk about stuff later on, okay? That's kind of an important point. All right. So let's talk about the separation of concerns. Here we go. So let's talk about, we've got our demo and semantic tags. We talk about attributes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about CSS. So we'll talk about doing inline styling, some style elements, some selectors, very important concepts, especially this one. We'll talk about how to use dev tools to interact with the CSS. I'm sure I've done it before. We'll talk about this thing called box model and box sizing. What on earth is that? What's a box? Well, I know what a box is, but what is a box when we refer to CSS? We'll talk about external style sheets, and then we'll talk about how to normalize a page, which is actually an interesting concept, which relates directly to what we're seeing right here. And we'll talk about this thing which I cannot pronounce, specificity. Oh, was I close? Specific. This thing, okay? I can't say that. All right. Specificity. I'll get it one day. Okay. So let's talk about separation of concerns. This is a cornerstone of software development. You're going to hear this term over and over again, certainly from me, because I'm a big one on this one. And unfortunately, one of the most common mistakes even experienced developers make is breaking this rule. This is a rule, yes, or a philosophy. I'll call it a rule. I'm going to call it the law. There. I'm so adamant about this. This is the law. You should have separation of concerns. What does that mean for us with our little web page here? Well, we have the HTML. We also have the CSS. Okay. So HTML is for the content and the rough order. That's its job. Okay. It has nothing to do with styling, even though we do see we're getting some funny styling out of these H1s here, but that's because of the browser. Okay. CSS, we know, deals with styles, colors, sizes, positions, even things like hovers, all the things that you see. That's CSS, that's its job. Okay, so HTML's job or its concern is to deal with this. The CSS, its concern is to deal with the styles. And we separate the concerns. We should not be allowing HTML to do any kind of styling. And certainly CSS, it's impossible. It can't do any kind of content. And the third member of our family, anyone know what that is? What are the three things that a browser can read? HTML, CSS, and what's the third thing? There are three things. And this is a hard and fast rule. There are only three things ever that browsers can interact with or consume: HTML, CSS, and what have we been learning the last few weeks? Yes, JavaScript. Thank you. JavaScript. So JavaScript is what the page does or the behavior of the page. So behavior. Okay. In other words, what the page does. That's JavaScript. No, JavaScript shouldn't be styling. It doesn't generally deal with content, although we can add content with JavaScript. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. And well, I should be doing that, right? Now, these can be in the same file. And oftentimes they are. But these are the different responsibilities. They're responsible for different jobs. Okay, so we're going to talk really mostly today about CSS. And that's really what we're dealing with, is CSS. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about some CSS. So right now my page has none. I mean, we know we have this implied, this one, we have our implicit styling we got from the browser. That's fine. There. But in general, there's no styling here, apart from my really cool profile picture of me. So we're going to add some style. Now, the first one we'll talk about are what are called inline styles. So we can put styles in the line. So right in a tag. For instance, I can add a style to H1. There. I can give it a color. I can say style, which is another attribute, style equals. And we give it a CSS directive. In other words, I'll say color, and I can give it a color. Now, looks like my VS Code is being very helpful for me. I can pick a named color. There's a lot of them. What did I just see? Cornflower blue, corn silk. Look at these colors. I love these names. Dark olive green, dark green. Is there just like a plain green? Ah, there is a plain green. There's a greeny yellow, goldenrod. Look at all these cool ones. So let's pick one. I'll go with fuchsia. Sure. Okay, so now the style of that H1 is fuchsia. Let's refresh that, and we change the style of that element to fuchsia. So that's one way. Now colors can take also different parameters. We can give it instead, we can give it an RGB. RGB like this. We can give it three numbers, which is red, green, and blue. For instance, I can give it 233, 44, and 4. Now, I'm guessing this is going to show up as mostly red. In fact, VS Code does show you on your thing you hover. Isn't that cool? Look at that. It shows the color. It looks like it's mostly red. And sure enough, it's kind of mostly red. This is not so common. We would do this programmatically, but we would not normally see it done this way, right? Another way of doing it is using hex or hexadecimal, okay? And now you have from 00 to FF. So I would go, maybe I'll go F0 for the red. What's that? That's like 250 something. Pretty big number, okay? And then maybe 16 and then A7. Here's a hexadecimal number. It's still red, green, and blue, RGB, but now it's in hex. So I'm getting some kind of interesting purpley pinky thing. Okay, so those are the three ways, but normally these days we go with the named because they're just so cool to use. There. Alice. Alice blue doesn't look so blue to me. Does that look blue to anybody? Take a look. Alice blue. That is not. Well, anybody see it? I guess Alice means like Alice in Wonderland. It's not even. It's like vanishes. So, not picking out acramine. I'm going to go with another one. Blue violet. I'm going to find a cool one. Anyone has a cool color? Deep sky blue. Doesn't look so deep. I like this one. Dark slate blue. That sounds like a nice, powerful color. Let's go with that one. There. Okay. So there's my inline CSS. Okay. Now styles can contain multiple items. Okay. For instance, we can give another style to this element. For instance, we could say maybe put a semicolon and we separate them with semicolon. We can say maybe maybe a strike through. Sure, I'll go ahead and add some kind of style or maybe decoration to this thing. I'll give it a text decoration. I'll say text dash decoration. There we go. And we'll pick all kinds of things. Strike through, dotted, dashed, wavy. What's wavy? I'm going to try wavy. I like that. Oh, doesn't look like anything. Okay, that's kind of anticlimactic. We'll go with underline. There. There. So now we have underlined. There we go. So these are inline styles, okay? Now, remember about one thing about CSS. CSS is declarative. You tell it what you want it to do, not how to do it. And that's an important point. We'll talk more about declarative later on. And certainly when we talk about React, it's all declarative with really HTML too, but CSS specifically, we want this thing to happen. I want it underlined. And CSS takes care of how to make it underlined. So declarative is all about the what, not the how. Kind of an important point. So I want this thing to be dark slate blue. How you do it, I don't care. Just make it happen. And that's the concept of declarative code. Okay. So CSS in general is a declarative language. There are no imperative instructions in CSS. CSS is all declarative. The language, unlike JavaScript, is an imperative language. You say, do this, then do this thing, then take this thing we just got and do this to it. That's an imperative language. But CSS, much like HTML, is an imperative or declarative language. We simply declare we like. All right. So now, this is an inline style, generally considered poor practice. We probably shouldn't be doing this. In fact, if you did this at work, your boss would probably give you a bit of an evil eye saying, what are you doing? You really should never have inline styles. Okay, this is pretty important. It would be exceedingly rare for us to have inline styles. Instead, we'd put our styles up in the header. We can put them here. So instead, I could put my styles right here. We'll put it inside a style tag like this. Oop, try it again. Come on, Emmett, help me out. Style, there it is. And we take these styles, and instead we take just the content of the styles like that, cut them out of there, and get rid of that style. They're considered evil. We don't want those. And we put the style in here instead. But what does that do? Like, seemed to work, but we said style, but we didn't tell it what to style. Like, we have to now specify, you want dark slate blue. Great. But to what? What should we make dark slate blue? And you probably know this already. We use this concept of selectors, right? These are called selectors. What to style? Well, what the heck is a selector? Now, this is going to be very important. This concept of selectors is going to be something that we deal with an awful lot. And remember that word, selector, because we use it in CSS and we also use it in jQuery an awful lot. We want to select something. So select from the DOM the thing I want to operate on. So for instance, I want to select, well, my H1. So I'm going to select an H1. Curly braces, and I put my style inside that. There. And this says, for any H1 you find, a little bit more there. For any H1, find them, and for all the H1s on the document, make the color dark slate blue and underlined. Refresh the page, looks exactly the same, but now the style is separate. Once again, another separation of concerns. Here is my style, and this is my content. So now I've done a better job of separating my CSS from my content, right? So each directive ends in a semicolon. If you don't do that, well, first off, CSS gets nasty. What does the browser do? Oh, it looks like something didn't work. It caught nothing. Did I get an error? Let's take a look. Well, there's no error going on because there's nothing happening, but the CSS engine could not parse it. It thought it was this, basically, which is color, and then this, which doesn't mean anything, and then this is ridiculous. So every directive must end with a semicolon. If you forget it, it is simply not going to style. And this is something I forget all the time. Like, I always forget these semicolons. Optional in JavaScript, but not optional in CSS. You must have them if you have more than one style element. And we can style multiple things. For instance, I want to style all the classes of doc. Let's do that. Okay. So I'm going to go dot doc. We'll talk about this after the break. And let's make all the dot docs. Let's make their color. Let's pick dark cyan. What's a cool one? Dark gray. Doesn't look so dark. Huh. Pick something cool. Dark red. Sure, dark red. Why not? So now all the docs will be dark red. And sure enough, all of my docs are dark red. Okay. We'll talk more about these kind of selectors after the break. All right. So in the meantime, before our break, let's do a quick attendance. And if I can get everyone to in the chat, we'll maybe we'll chat something like coding with style. So as our attendance, everyone type coding with style. Right, everyone? So why don't we take a very quick break? We'll come back after the break and we will talk about CSS more. Right. So I'll see everyone in 10. So we talked a little bit about how to use selectors to assign styles to elements. Okay. So for example, we can use on an element, we simply say H1. That means with no decoration. In other words, if I just say H1 with no prefix in front of it, that means look for every element H1. And that is what's called an element selector. That's the jargon we use, element selector. Okay. We also did a class selector, dot. So putting a dot in front of a word or text means find a class doc or anything with class equals doc. That's what the dot means. Okay. We'll look at a couple more as well, right? Now, one thing we can do, let's look at our app and you'll find when doing CSS styling, we use our browser dev tools a lot. So open my dev tools and you can go in the inspector and sure enough, we can see all the elements. We've done this before, but down below, we can also look at the styling for those elements. For instance, my body. Well, my body has no styling. It's just element styling. Let's try to find make it a little larger, there, a little bigger so we can see it. Let's try to find my header or maybe my H1. Let's click on that one. Well, there's my H1. It has styling. And the styling came from this. It came from the fact it's an H1. So here's the rule that applied the following styles. It says element, there's no styling on the element. In other words, there's no inline styling. Okay, we'll talk more about precedence, but there is no inline. We took it out. Instead, we matched element. And we said match H1, color is dark slate blue, and text decoration is underlined. So we use this a lot. We'll use this more a bit later, but this is very, very handy. And we spend an awful lot of time as CSS developers inside dev tools to check our styles. All right. The question is, if you have multiple styles applying to the same class that applies things like color, how does a browser decide what to use? Excellent question. And we're going to talk about things like specificity. That's not even close, is it? And precedence a little later. But good point. That's an excellent point. Generally, it is applied last one wins if it's the same thing. But we'll talk more about it later. But generally, the last one wins. Okay. All right. Let's go back. And so selectors, once again, classes start with a period. So dot doc, it'll match anything with a doc. So if I want something to be this dark red, let's give it a class. Maybe this thing, if I give it a class equals dot doc, I guess not the best name. Well, if I do this now I can get my like, oh, did I save it? Class equals dot doc. Oh, class equals doc. Thinking too much dots here. There. And now my contact me is red. So it matches all of the things with the class in one line, but we don't want that one red. So we'll take that class out. Okay. And there are other classes we can add. For instance, we could maybe put our profile page or something else. Maybe I want these to be slightly bold, for instance. So let's go, maybe we'll say font. Oh, look, it's font weight, wow, font style, font family, font, all this fonts. Well, I can go font weight and I can give it a number, or I can give it maybe bold, bolder, light, lighter, calculated, which won't do. Let's go weight equals bold. Now it is anyways, right? Okay, but now my weight is bold. Or maybe we'll say font weight perhaps lighter. What do I get now? Well, not much difference yet. There's a reason for that later, but it's a little lighter than before. Okay, so you can control lots of imperatives. There's almost too many to remember. We'll deal with a few of these today. Okay, so with a class, we can go dot, and with an element, we simply give a name. There's also IDs. We can select IDs. And to select the ID, we go, you probably know already, we go pound, right? Or the hash symbol. So header, for instance. So I want to select anything with an ID or a ID of that, I can pick that. We won't use too many IDs today, but I can certainly say, pick a color, maybe, what color? Where's a more dark violet? Have you used that? Let's pick another one. Goldenrod? Why not? So anything with an ID of header is going to end up as the color goldenrod. Let's take a look. Sure, it looks beautiful to me. Okay. All right. So now we can also, now this is applying selectors directly, but there's other ways to apply selectors. For instance, maybe I want to look not by a class or an ID or an element. You can, for example, talk about the child-parent relationship. For instance, I could say, well, I want any P that is the child of a footer. There, so if it's the child of a footer, be a certain color, but not a P that is a child of an article. So for instance, we could do this. We could say a P, or in this case, it would be an article, or footer rather, a footer P. There, whoops. There we go. So any one where the P is a direct descendant of the parent, so P is direct descendant of footer, I can make this go color, running out of colors here. Have you used chartreuse yet? Not yet. Okay, so take a look. There. So a direct parent, but you can also just do a descendant of. In other words, I would go, in this case, if I go footer space P, that means a P that is a child or grandchild or great-grandchild. In other words, body, I could say body image or body section. So having this greater than sign implies a direct parent-child relationship. So P is the immediate child of footer, whereas footer space P means that the P is just somewhere in there, okay? In other words, a child or maybe a grandchild or great-grandchild. So it depends how you want to get more specific. So you can be pretty specific in targeting your elements this way. And we do this all the time in CSS with selectors. Okay, so I'll just do P for now, but just, if you see this greater than sign, this means the immediate child. That's all it means. This way it means a P anywhere contained within a footer. There we go. Okay. We can also specify multiples. So let's say I want for every, let's take a look, maybe every aside and every P and every article, for instance, to have something in particular. So I could go every P, comma, article, comma, and I'll say H2. I may have some conflicting. We separate them with commas like this. There. And we say, let's take, maybe it's a decoration. We'll do a text decoration. There. Decoration. We'll say underline for now. Okay. Now, take a look. There. So that happened as well. Okay. So you can do multiple items. I'll take this out for now. It's not necessary. But sometimes you want to apply a single styling to multiple elements without having duplication like this. So you'd use, and of course you can combine. You can go a main space P, which means a P within a main, right? So, or maybe a P within a footer only, like this, comma. The possibility is pretty much endless, okay? Right. So lots of fun. Now, as you probably noticed, this is kind of a slow process. I mean, you kind of go change it, you got to save it, go to your browser, hit refresh, and see what you got. It's kind of painful doing that. It's an awful lot of work, isn't it? Well, it turns out there's a much easier way to do this using DevTools. So let's make this a lot bigger. So now we're going to make this like our main window. This is like our development window when we can use our dev tools. It is a tool and we can develop in this tool. So let's pick my CSS demo. That's my H1. That's in my body. There it is right there. Click on that and I can see that the style it's got right now, a little taller, there. It's an H1. I can turn these off. Let's turn off that color. There. It's kind of hard to see. Let's take up the decoration. And we can actually edit. We can also add, for instance, what if I want to give it a border? A border. There. I can give it a border of a blue border. Space. There. Oops. Again. There we go. Border. And I'll say blue. Okay. And maybe 1px. There. Now, hard to see because it's right there, but you can add the border, or you can add and remove any kind of styling to an element. Border is a bad example because it's an H1. So you can add all kinds of styling directly. For instance, let's pick one that doesn't have one. Let's turn that off. Let's pick one that doesn't have one. For instance, let's go to our aside. Let's find our aside here. There, right now has no styling at all. So I can add a style. Now, we add this to the element. I'm going to say color and aqua. There. And it changes immediately. Let's make it large so we can see it. So we can develop inside our dev tools with no need to refresh, which really makes our life much, much easier. Okay. So generally, it's good to have In CSS, to have your dev tools on the right. However, for JavaScript, I almost always put my dev tools on the bottom because those console logs get long and all kinds of things. Okay. By default, your Chrome or your Firefox will have the dev tools on the right, which is pretty good for doing CSS development. Right. It's getting really beautiful profile page. I love it. Okay. Okay, so we also turn styles off. So let's find my footer. What have I got here? Here's my contact me right there. And of course I can turn off the chartreuse. Now you notice this is the class I'm turning off. So it affects all of them. This is the footer space P selector. So for every one of them, I'm turning it off. I can add something to the element instead, right? What happens if I go color and I say brown? What am I going to get? Oh, well, now it turns brown on this element, but this one stays green. We'll talk more about why this page. And you notice this strikeout here. What does that mean? Huh. So when you see this, this means even though this selector found it, it tried to apply this, but it couldn't. It has a strike. This means this particular style was overridden by something else. And we'll talk about more about that at the end. In other words, this element has overridden that. Okay, and that's a really cool feature of CSS in that you have this precedence of how CSS is applied to elements. Okay, and once again, we refresh and everything is back normal again. So it's much faster to develop using your browser and DevTools. Okay, now one thing you might notice in your browser, if you do make a change to your code and you hit refresh, it's like, oh, it didn't change. That can happen because you have what's called the browser cache. Anybody know how to do a hard refresh of their browser? Anyone tried that before? It's something I do a lot, especially when you're developing. It's a hard refresh. In a Mac, it is a Command Shift R, or yeah, thank you, Lewis. On a Windows, it is Control F5. So Control F5 does a hard reload of your page, or on a Mac, it's Command Shift R will do refresh. And the reason for that is if I do, let's look at my network. Let me explain why. Let's show how that happens. So there's all my pages. Let's refresh my page. It might not do it. Now this is a pretty dumb, it's not the world's smartest browser. No. Sometimes you'll get what's called a 304. Remember we talked about this last time, a 304? That means the web server noticed that nothing's changed since the last thing I've served this out. Now, this little HTTP server thing, it's not very smart. Okay, it always serves it out. So in this case, it's not a big deal. But other ones might give you a 304, which means, and it might not know that the CSS has changed. And it sends a 304 to the browser. The browser just shows it again. And you have to do a hard refresh or a Control F5 or Command Shift R. So just keep it in mind. If you notice that you're getting your changes not applying, do your hard refresh. Okay, right. There we go. So let's talk about something else. It's called the box model. Now we'll talk about inline styles. We got elements there. Talk about selectors, and we talked about how to use our dev tools. Let's talk about the box model. What the heck is the box model? Okay. Well, the box model is really how everything is built on the page. In other words, on the page, there, box model. Everything is a box. It's like a profound philosophical statement. Everything's a box. Yes. Or the important thing is there is no box. Yes. Okay. Even better. Okay. Everything's a box. What does that mean? Okay. Well, on a web page, everything truly is a box. Let's take a look at our dev tools and we can turn on our layout. There, we can go to what's called computed. Hold on. Pick one. There we go. Okay. Computed or we'll go layout there. Okay. On a Chrome, we can go into computed and it will show the box. So each box, we can go here. So everything is a box. They have different sizes. Let's click on this image. Where's that image? It's my main, my section, my header, image. Oh, it has a size of 200 by 19. So this is the box model. Okay. There are 4 attributes to every item on the page. There. And they're all boxes. First off, we have the content. Let's go to pick some text here. Let's pick there my CSS demo. There we go. So this is my CSS demo there. And you can see it truly is a box. It had the content right there. That is 260 point whatever pixels wide and 37 pixels plus high. Okay. This is the content. Outside of the content, it's what's called the padding. Okay. It's the padding. It's still within the box, but this is the padding. This is the space around the content. And then we have a border, optionally. The border surrounds the actual outside of the element. Okay. And the last element is what's called the margin. The margin is the space between this element and this element right there. So we've got this there, my profile page. There's its content margin, and here's the CSS. And you notice they butt right up against each other exactly with no space in between. Now it looks like there's space, but what you're seeing, of course, is the margins between the two. The H2 there and H2 there. Now they share a margin on top and bottom. That's just the spacing between it and the next. They're not additive. So you don't add the two margins. Really, the largest one wins that has the margin on all sides. All right. So that's the box model, and every single element can have their own value. So I can change. Let's change the margin. Maybe I'll change the margin left. Let's make that to 100. Oh, now I've added a left margin, and sure enough, my CSS demo moves off to the right a bit. Let's make it also maybe only a margin of 10. There we go. So I've added a margin left to my CSS demo H1. Right. Okay, so the content is controlled by the size of the thing within it. For instance, this image, this picture, it looks like it must be 200 pixels high. It just is. So the content expands to fit, or the box of the content box expands to fit the content. Okay, right. But we can adjust the padding. So we can go 3 here. So how do we do that in CSS? Let's go to our CSS here. For instance, with our profile page, let's adjust some padding and things. Let's go, I think it's my H2, isn't it? That's my H2. Okay. So let's take our H2. Let's go H2. We'll say H2 there. And we want our H2, oops, come on, curly braces. Okay, a little smaller. So I want to say my H2, I want to have a padding of 20. So padding of 20 and 20 what? You can say 20%, wouldn't recommend it. 20, a lot of different things. The things we generally use are pixels or EMs. Anybody heard the term EM? Let's take a look. What's an EM? An EM is actually a better one to use generally, okay? And there's a reason for that. So what is CSS EM? What is an EM? What is that thing? Okay, it is a unit of measurement that is relative to the size of the current font size. So it's very useful. If you just say pixels, then it doesn't matter what size your fonts are. But if you say EM, if I expand my page like this, the EMs grow with it. So you'll find EMs are used a lot in CSS because it keeps everything relative. So if I say 1 EM, that means whatever the current default font size is. If I say 1 EM, it'll be the size of the font. So we can go 1 EM. Take a look. Okay, so there's the padding. In other words, 1 EM padding around the profile. Let's take a look at the DevTools. What's that look like? What did that do? DevTools, we'll inspect this element. And where's our box? So now it says, look at this. It says now the padding is 24. So it looks like it's 24. Okay, very cool. Now you notice, even though I change the size of the content, this is still saying the same because the padding is the size of the font, which in this case, it's a 24 high font for an H1 in this case. Okay, that's our padding. Now I can do different things. I can say padding this way, or we can also do things like maybe want the padding left or just the padding right. So instead I can go padding and I can go padding left. I want the padding left to be 2 EM instead. What's that look like? Okay, so now a bit more padding. It's not looking that great. It's a bit more off to the right, okay? Or you can go padding right, padding top, and padding bottom, or you can combine them all in one. You can do this instead. You can go padding and give it 4 numbers. So padding top, and you can go padding right is maybe 1 EM right, maybe 2 EM bottom, and 4 EM is left. Okay, so it goes top, right, bottom, left. And I'm afraid to see what I did here. Well, it's not as bad as I thought. Okay, so very common. We use this for multiple paddings. Okay, or maybe I don't want any. I'll go 0 for my left instead. So 0 EM. There. Okay, I should go 0 like that. There. Oh, I've also got a margin that's being coded in there. All right. Oh, that's my top. So my left. Oh, my 0 and my left is here. There. So it's top, right, bottom, left. So I'll go, my top is 1 EM. There. Try it again. There we go. Okay, so now my left padding is 0. We can do the same with the margin. And you might ask yourself, what about this? What if I just did this and I did padding left equals 3 EM? What's going to happen here? Now I have conflicting paddings. Well, what happens, of course, the last one wins, but these two still stick around. Okay, my left is here, but these ones still apply. That's one of the reasons it's called cascading style sheets. They cascade, in other words, just because I did this, these ones still apply. So any styling on the element trickles down to, or trickles down for the previous one. So I applied padding here, or perhaps on some other, maybe from some class, I applied this padding, but on the H2 apply this, it will still trickle down to here unless I'm overriding, in case this guy I'm saying more specific, I'm saying padding left. And we'll talk once again about specificity. I got that right that time. Specificity a little later. Okay. Okay. So this isn't so bad. How's my page looking? Okay. Same with margin. I can add a margin. margin. I can go margin bottom, and I'll go 1 EM. Now it's going to pad its spacing between it and other elements. Let's put a border. We'll go 2 PX and solid. We're going to make a solid border. Let's watch what it looks like. Oh, and hold on. There. Don't forget your semicolons. So this is my border. Now remember, the margin is outside of the border. Okay, so I change my padding, maybe my bottom padding. I'll change that to 0 EM. Now I have 0 padding between the content and the border, but I still have the margin on the bottom, which means the space between this item's margin, which is 0 right now, and its margin, because right now my image has no margin by default. So by default, there is 0 margin and 0 padding by default. Let's prove that. There we go. Let's pick an element that we haven't touched, which is getting pretty hard. What haven't we touched here? Let's find one. This one, nope, we touched that one. Image, actually we hadn't touched the image. So by default, items have 0 margin, a 0 width, which is no border, and 0 padding. So what's happening is this element here, there. If you notice, there's its content, but it hasn't got any yellow or blue. But this one has the purple is the padding, the light blue is the content, and the yellow is the margin. So the margin of this one butts up against. In fact, I can add a margin to my, there. We'll go 4. Oh, maybe bigger. 10. There we go. So now the margin of my profile picture is now butting up against, you can see right there, it butts up against the margin. So on a page, everything is tight against each other. And the spacing is controlled by margins, the spacing between elements. The spacing of the content within the element, or within the border, is controlled by padding. It does take a bit of getting used to, but we use a combination of these things to arrange things on the page, okay? So that's really how we work on things in CSS. It's really, really cool, okay? So we'll be doing a lot of this in our Tweeter application for the first day or two, where we try to position things on the page. We'll also talk about a Flexbox a bit. We're going to have a lecture on Flexbox, so I won't be touching on that today, for how to do much more precise positioning of things, okay? Let's talk about box model and now box sizing. So let's take a look. I think there's actually a box sizing. Take a look here. Let's go box, is it box model? Border box? Let's take a look. I know there's a little demo that we can play with that allows us to do this. Let's go box model demo. Let's try this. Interactive box model. Take a look at this one. Oh, there we go. This one's hard to see. Okay. So we'll play with this a lot. We can play, of course, change things. We can change the size of these things, all kinds of cool things, right? And see how they interact. And you can add more. We could add another one. For instance, we could add a second one. Take this one and put it there. Now we have 2 boxes side by side. There, okay. And we can interact with, we can control how these 2 boxes interact with each other, okay? This one's kind of annoying because it's got this stuff. But the important thing is what's called the box sizing. There are 2 ways to size a box. Let's go here instead. You can size the box based on the content. So if you say height, you give something a height. The height is based on the content, but the height also then adds on the padding, the border, and the margin. Okay. So what we commonly do instead is we like to switch modes, and we switch what's called border box sizing. And this is much more common. If we switch to border box, then this is the box. It is the box of the border. So now, regardless of the content and the padding, the box will be the one that is the size. So you can say, I want this item to be 3 em big. You don't have to do calculation and calculate the content and the padding. You just will do it directly. Okay. And to do that, we do the following thing. This is something we almost always do these days. We add a little selector to our CSS right here. And I say wildcard for everything. I want everything to use box sizing, use border box. That's it. It's a very simple thing, but you'll find this makes our life easier for positioning things and lining boxes up. Because if you have one box that has a certain height and you want that box to align with another box, well, if you're in using, there we go, where's our little site? There it is. Using content box sizing, you have to do kind of a calculation to determine, well, what's the box plus its padding plus the thickness of the border. Whereas with border box, you just forget about it. So I recommend just put this in all your CSS. Go with border box. It will make your life much, much easier. Okay. All right. Did that affect us? What happened? So now I've got this. Let me change this. And okay, things shifted slightly, didn't they? Not much, but there was a slight shift in the size because of the way the sizing is being done. Okay. So now we can put our style inside our HTML page like this, but honestly, this is not commonly done. This is not something we usually do, okay? Instead, we almost always have our CSS outside. For small files, sure, I've done this before. For a very small file, yeah, I just stick it inside here. But for any kind of real application, we almost never see the style tag used like ever. It's almost never used. Instead, we put it in an external file or external CSS. We make a file, index.css. Now, depending on the pattern that whatever company you work for uses, they may have a different way of doing it. I tend to like calling the name of the CSS file the same name as the HTML file that it references. So if I have app.html, I'll have an app.css. If I have a about.html, I'll have an about.css. We generally only have one CSS that is specific to a file. We also may have some global CSS files. We'll talk about that in a second. How does that work? Well, just take my style like this and I cut that out and I can put that inside my file just like that with no tags around it, because now this is pure CSS. So there's nothing but CSS in this external file. And now I don't need these style tags. So what do I get? Now I'm back to having really no styling at all and just some default styles here on my H1s and H2s. Okay. So in order to link the files together, we use the link element. That is normally done in the header or in the head of our HTML. So we put a link tag and it's probably an Emmet. Yeah, and I can go, let's pick, is there one here? Ah, look, link CSS. I love VS Code's Emmet, okay? And the format is you go rel, or the relationship is. So this is a link, and the relationship between this link and this page, this thing we're importing is a style sheet, okay? And the name of the file, in this case, it is index.css. So now when our browser loads this page, or this HTML, it's going to come across this link statement, and it's going to tell the browser that, oh, I need something. So the browser itself is going to do an internal get back to the server or wherever and try to find this file. Okay, so let's watch this happen. Let's go to our dev tools. We're going to open up our network tab right here. Wider. There we go. So let's now refresh our page and watch what happens. So yes, this came back, but now there's our get for our first page right there. Look at the very next get. It said get index CSS. And of course, it got my profile picture and the fave icon, which we just get for free. We haven't got one, we've got a 404. So it fetched my CSS. So now I have an even better separation of concerns. I have my HTML only contains the content, and my CSS file only contains the CSS. This is by far the most common way we do it. It is a much better separation of concerns, okay? Right. So now it's important to note that the order matters, okay? For example, if I have another CSS before this, maybe some other CSS that does something else. Maybe it also sets some of these. Well, depending on the order of these two files, maybe it's index 1, which doesn't exist. Depending on the order of these two files, one of them might override somebody else's CSS. Okay, so the order does matter. And as we know, the last one wins. We know that, okay? So let's talk about that, because what we can do in our page is override or fix the fact that we have these default styles. Like, let's take this out. Let's uncomment that again. There. So now we know we should have no styling at all. But we know already we do have styling. We have this and this. We talked about the default browser styling. This is the browser. Now I'm using Firefox. If I load this page in my Chrome, let's do that. Open my Chrome right here. It's open the same page. What do I get? Now it's hard. Let's make it default size and default size. There we go. Are they the same? I can't really tell. I'm not sure if they are. I think, I'm thinking the Chrome's a bit bigger. I think it's slightly wider. I can't quite tell. But anyway, the point is, you never know. You can't depend on that. So there are some default sizes. So this div and this div may have a different default size depending on the browser or the device. It might not be just a matter of Firefox and Chrome or Edge. It may be the browser on your phone or device that you're targeting. So you can't rely on these defaults, and some of them may interfere with what you want. You may get unexpected sizing happening. Go, what's going on? It looks funny on this browser. What's happening here? That's likely because the default size that the browser picked interfere with some of your styling. So what do we do? How do we fix this problem? Well, we do what's called a CSS reset. Okay. And now this is done by importing another style sheet. We already know we can import our own style sheets. We can also import other ones, and there's lots of them. You can download really cool. Anybody heard of a thing called Bootstrap, right? We have Bootstrap. Probably heard of this one. Might have used it in your Tiny app. It is also a library that allows you to style things, and there's many other libraries you can use. Okay, so but we want to make sure that we get our page to look exactly the way we want. And because not every browser has the same defaults, this might change some of the way that our page looks. And for that, we use what's called a CSS reset. And that is actually a thing. Let's find one. CSS reset. There, that is a thing right there. There's lots of them, okay? And the one I usually use is this one there. CSS Tools, Reset CSS. It's a very simple little file. Look what it does. It simply says for every possible item, make all of these no special size, no margin, no font. It really resets everything to a baseline that you can depend on. So if you run the CSS, it will take every element that you could possibly have and size it or style it to a predictable baseline point. Okay. And the way that works, we can take this file, which is grab a copy right there. Let's grab that URL right there. Now, we could, of course, download it and put it in our file or our project, but I don't feel like doing that. Instead, I'm going to simply put that right here. So I'll uncomment that line, and I'm going to put that reference right there. So now I've reset all the defaults that my browser might have on every single item. Let's watch what happens when that runs. There, well, look at that. So now an H1 and an H2 looks exactly the same as a div. Nothing has any default spacing at all, and everything is down to a baseline. So now if I apply my styling here, now, oh, well, now look at this. I didn't specify a font, so now all of these are predictable size. There's no default spacing. Now, I haven't added any margins or padding or any kind of positioning, so this is exactly what I expected. Of course, now I'm going to have to add all this stuff, but before, without this one, you notice I was relying on some default spacing that maybe you get for free from the browser, and you can't count on that. So we always recommend when you're writing a site, start with two things. Set your box model to border box and also add a reset to make sure that what your starting point is always predictable, and that way it'll always look the same. And that's pretty important. We do this quite often now. And also looks the same on every browser. Right. One more thing to talk about. We're going to talk about the word I can't pronounce, which is specificity. I'm going to say it 5 times fast. I can't do it. Specificity. Okay, that wasn't bad. So what this means is, what if we have conflicts? In other words, we have this. We have, well, I've got this H2, okay, or maybe a dock. So everything with a dock, I want to be red. But what if I have maybe something else? What else is dock? If I have an article, I want all articles to be blue. What's going to happen? So if I say, well, articles should be blue, so I'll say article. Let's make articles color blue. And don't forget the semicolon, because I always forget that. There. What am I going to see? No blue articles. We'll take out my reset for now, because it looks a little nicer with the reset. There. Just comment our reset for now. Oh, come on. There we go. But my articles didn't turn blue. They're still, was that color? Dark red. What's going on? Let's inspect that. What could have happened here? Inspect. Let's look at the style for this one. Okay. Okay, so my article there. Okay, so that is dark red. Okay. So, of course, what's happened with my article, there we go, is because I've got a class instead, right? I've got a picture that describes this. Let's take a look. I've got a little, there, let's grab this little file here. Okay. So here is how CSS decides how to override things. Elements. It's like a 4-digit number. So this is the ones, the tens, the hundreds, and thousands for just elements. For example, just saying article, that gets a score of 1. That's it, just 1. Okay. And by the way, the highest score wins. So when I said element here, I got a score of 1. But if you notice this, classes have a score of 10. So what happened was score of 1, score of 10. Guess which one wins? Well, the 10, because I'm using a class. Okay. So, and then IDs. If I had an ID, for instance, if I had an ID on this one article, I'll say ID equals pets. And I want to make some CSS. I'll say pound pets. And we'll go with the color. And I'm running out of colors. I know there's like 64,000 of them, and I've run out already. What is not even close to what I've used before? Dark green, maybe? I think dark green. No, what's my docs? Yeah, they're fine. Okay, there. Pets. What's going to happen to my pets? My pets is dark green because in our specificity, an ID is worth 100. Okay, so clearly it'll override any class or any element. Okay. The last thing, of course, is inline styles. If I literally have an inline style, in other words, if I say this one here, style equals that, this trumps everything. Okay. It is now the most specific you can get. CSS is all about least specific to most specific, and the most specific directive wins. Now, we shouldn't be doing that. But if we do, it basically trumps everything. And that's the style that gets applied, or at least that part of the style. If I said something else, but didn't refer to color, the color it would get from probably this ID pets. If I just said style border and then 1px solid like that, it's going to happen here. There. So I got a border, but the color still came from that ID because this directive didn't say anything about color. It just said style. So this border is forced, but everything else is fair game. So ID pets, that came from my ID style right here. So this is an important point, this specificity. I'm getting better at that. Knowing that elements are last or least, and inline styles most, which don't use IDs. We also try to avoid using IDs for styling. Sometimes it can't get away from it, but I would recommend use a combination of classes and elements to style your elements. And by the way, one last thing, you can even hover. Let's hover over this. You notice specificity. Look at this. How about this one? 1,000. You notice it's telling me if I hover over pets, 100. This is 100 rather. Okay. Article is just a 1. A dot, that's a class. That's a 10. So this even tells you what the specificity is. It's pretty cool. Right. That's our talk today on CSS. We'll have another talk a little later in the week, and we'll be starting on our Tweeter app very soon. So thank you, everyone. I know it's late, and thank you for coming out tonight. It's great to see everyone again, and I will see everyone again next week.